Welcome to the 6th actual instalment of What Garbage Takes Does Squid Have About This Status? And this one is going to be a pain. Simply put, Tremor is a mess to get into, and it's thanks to what PM decided to make the main gimmick of this status. You might, if you were somehow watching this video when Limbus first released, think that I'm referring to Tremor Burst, but no, that's at least a fairly simple design. What I'm complaining about is amplitude conversion, entanglement, and the 9 current godforsaken variants of the status, admittedly 2 of these don't actually come up, but I digress, that I have to bring up to actually make this video make sense. Launch Tremor was simple, you didn't use it because it didn't help. Mechanically, bursting Tremor was just worse than dealing that much actual damage, and none of those IDs were good. To demonstrate, here's one of our 2 non-base launch Tremor IDs. Zwei South Sinclair is absolute garbage, and despite having no ways to lower Tremor count in his kit, he still can't sustain any amount. I don't have any more to say on him. As for LCCB-ish, our other option, while you'd struggle to find anyone today who thinks she's good, it's hard for me to actually trash this ID. Even as a 00, she was fine for the time, number-wise, and has Tremor infliction that's great by today's standards, even if it's limited to just her S2 and limited by ammo. You don't run her anymore, but you sure did before Canto 7. I won't go into E.G.O for those 2 just yet, mostly because Sync has none, and issues would interrupt my narrative, so I'll move on to our only Tremor ID released in Season 1. N-Corp Don, in spite of her incredible art and VA work, it's just not a good ID. Sure, with the standard of the time she was average, but she got nothing to help with Uptide 4, is slow as molasses, and mostly outclassed by another Don ID. That said, she does have surprisingly good Tremor count infliction once her passive is online. All her skills that inflict Tremor inflict nails on the first coin, and that allows her S1 and S3 to be +2 count per. Still not good though, and likely an ID that'll never see use again. Season 2 actually had Tremor as a major theme, with 6 Tremor IDs in the first 3 weeks. Sunshower and Spicebush will be left in the sinking vid, but the other 4 do give me a lot to talk about. Starting with Rosebanner Myrrh, and once again it's a 00 that was fine for the time, and then got power crept much later. He's kind of a potency machine, with all his skills applying pretty good chunks of Tremor, and assuming his admittedly high conditionals are active, he gets an effective 13, 15, 17. Nothing special, but again, this was before standardisation. His S3 is talked to death, but I want to crack at it myself. For some reason PM valued 1.25 Tremor bursts as worth 3 Tremor counts? Even if you had infinite charge for Myrrh, which he can only get himself via E.G.O or the skill that spends it, the effect caps at 1.5 bursts? Baffling stuff. Finally, I get to talk about a triple-O. Spoiler alert though, she's not good. Rosebanner Rojon is an ID I genuinely hate. First, her roll's an absolute ass. 10, 14, 19, assuming her S2 has its conditional, is just an awful start, not helped by her bad infliction. Now, that said, she's not entirely worthless. Her S2, while effectively unclashable, is a pretty decent damage dealer, only slightly worse than KK Hong's Cloud Cutter. Her S3 is an interesting design, being the first skill with 2 Tremor bursts, even counting E.G.O, and then having an on-hit after both bursts to get some bonus damage on staggered enemies. She even has a pretty synergistic passive that both increases stagger threshold raises by spending charge, and then gives her free haste and blunt damage up after a burst. I don't know why it's blunt damage up, given that her main damage skill is Pierce, but who cares? And as for the last Rosebanner ID, Gregor is not really relevant here. He does have Tremor, and even bursts, but he's entirely focused on Rupture, with everything else in his kit there to boost Rupture infliction. I could go into detail and even mention his E.G.O, but I'm too busy writing out more scathing insults to him, sorry. The best thing he has is Unbrilliant Glory, but as good as that is, it doesn't warrant running Rosebanner. Thankfully, Wulp just gave him an actually good ID, so he'll be mentioned quite a bit later. Also, I really want to mention my friend's favourite ID, Sloshing Ishmael, what a piece of work. Honestly, the worst part of this ID is that it's entirely possible to fix her. If she had Hong's Tarnished Blood, this ID would actually work almost exactly as intended. She still wouldn't be good, mind. Her skills are all entirely mid for a Season 2 00. Her passive requires her to just not deal damage, as though 26 shield per turn would be some huge problem, and her S3 eats 4 goddamn Tremor count for a single burst and 5 Rupture. She's not even that funny, her rolls aren't that low for an ID intended to lose clashes, and she lacks any real abysmal skills to mock, past her S3's -4 Tremor counts. Because it's still not time to mention good IDs, Mola Sinclair is yet another garbage 00. He does have the actual unique effect of a 4-coin S1, an interesting usage of self-tremor, and one of only 2 sources of rupture protection. He's also notable for another reason. Ignoring that, his passive is a bit too conditional for my liking, given that it requires 2 hoops to jump through, and doesn't really help Tremor build up potency or count much faster. Honestly, for how actually unique he is, I'm surprised more 00 defenders don't bring him up. He's bad, sure, and absolutely not worth running anywhere, but he seems exactly like what 00 fans want. Mola-ish isn't exactly a Tremor ID, her only infliction is 3 count from her S2. I also went into detail on her last time, so I prefer to save my breath for more relevant IDs. Though, I do want to bring up something I didn't notice in the sinking vid. For some reason, her evade, while an entirely reasonable ceiling of 14, is also a 10 floor instead of the usual 4 plus 10. And finally, I get to bring up an ID that isn't just utterly miserable. Mola Office E is, while not an ID you'd actually run these days, at least an ID with something resembling actual numbers. An 11, 16, 13 spread unconditionally, and then a somewhat difficult 13, 16, 19 is at least fine, although his -2 offense level on the S1 hurts, as does his lack of any conditions on the S2. Thankfully, he's a discard ID, and while he's nothing special in that regard, being one of a pair of self-tremor discard IDs, it's still enough to make him the best ID so far. I'd say more, but given the next ID is pretty damn similar, there's not much to add. He's relatively good, and you probably use him for the support passive. Mola Outers is the first ID you might actually run. It's only took 6.5 minutes. She's a slightly more complex ID than any of the previous, and also has a couple pieces of E.G.O to bring up as well. First, she's got an 11, 18, 16 base spread, and a 13, 18, 24 with conditions. Easily the best numbers so far. Her actual Tremor infliction is lackluster, with nothing on the S1, 4 on the S2, and 4 on the S3, with no count infliction that isn't instantly eaten, and an S2 that eats count if Outers has a decent chunk. Her actual strength is just having an obscene amount of Tremor bursts, along with discard to cycle back to those skills faster, all in a package that can actually clash when she doesn't roll 2 S1s. Her passive is a small buff to her Tremor bursts, but only works on enemies with remaining stagger thresholds, and caps at 20 extra damage. Before I get to E.G.O though, it's worth mentioning that these two were a clear attempt to fix the issues Tremor was suffering from. Both of them had direct buffs to their bursts, and were given pretty pushed kits, at least for the time. Sunshower isn't worth my time to discuss, and Holiday might be even worse, so I'll skip over to Binds. This is a far later piece, and one that serves as a good example of amplitude conversion. By base, it's a fairly standard war, with a big roll, high cost, a condition for extra weight, and a delayed SP payment. Although it's odd in having an 8 SP per turn cost, as opposed to the nearly universal 10 per turn. The on-hits are underwhelming, with 6 Tremor, a burst that has twice the stagger threshold raise, and then the aforementioned conversion. As with all conversions, you replace the current Tremor type with a new one. With all current alternate Tremors, you retain the 2 usual effects, and then get whatever new bonuses the converted Tremor has. In this case, a conditional for +1 stagger level, or in layman's terms, plus 0.5 to a staggered enemy's resistances. Now, if you converted some other Tremor over the current one, you'd lose whatever bonuses it had, replacing it with a new type, except for Fracture, because of course, due to it actually raising the stagger level directly, if you replace it on a staggered enemy, they keep the increased stagger level. And as for the passive, it's both simple and pretty decent. Normally I'm bitter over on kill passives, but this one has a pretty decent reward, and also triggers on staggering the target, which isn't hard in Tremor. And this overclock is great, if you can get a tails hit. 2 extra Tremor bursts, 3 Tremor count, and all for some pretty reasonable resource costs. A Binds is just a surprisingly good E.G.O, honestly. Next, we get to our first contentious ID, and our first Warp one at that. Regret Faust, despite being Faust's only Tremor ID, still has a debate on if you'd run her, despite no real debate on if she's good. This may be odd to those of you who don't touch Tremor, and I can't blame you for not knowing why, but her competition will be one of the last things I bring up for IDs. As for Regret herself though, she's pretty interesting. An 11, 16, 18 with no conditionals anywhere in her kit past a gimmicky passive, a skill 1 with gain 3 Tremor count written out on 3 consecutive lines despite being a 1-coin skill, an obscene passive that was the first to directly affect allies, the only passive with actual flavour text, and weight on both the S2 and S3. Her infliction is pretty decent, Her S1 applies 3 count, her S2 applies 5 potency, and then a pile of nice debuffs, and her S3, while count negative, is up to 3 bursts against 3 enemies. Her E.G.O will be brought up again later, but I should probably still mention it now. Everlasting is a stupid piece, and it'll rapidly become clear why, if somehow you didn't already know. First, for reasons beyond my understanding, it applies somewhere between a 10-10 and 20-20 Tremor stack, bursts 4 times, reduces count by 4, and as the cherry on top, you halve the target's max speed next turn. The main upside, however, is amplitude entanglement. Now this will take a moment to explain, especially with the absolutely fucked effects of Tremor Everlasting. When triggering entanglement, you replace the target's current Tremor type with Tremor Superposition, an effect that mostly serves as a shell for the rest of entanglement's effects, but you don't replace the original effects of the prior Tremor type. If the target had Fracture already, as an example, you keep the effect to increase stagger level when the victim gets staggered, while also adding the effect of the entanglement. In the case of Everlasting, you get a Tremor Potency % chance to gain an additional Tremor Burst whenever one triggers from a skill or coin, not status or passives, this will matter later, and the same for Tremor Counts. Both of these are capped at separate 50% chances, but in a normal use case, you'll average doubling your Tremor Bursts. The corrosion is genuinely one of the worst in the game. I cannot think of any situation where it's worth overclocking given the absurd cost, reduced damage, tremor and bursts, all for 2 extra weight. The passive is good, but rarely actually triggers, given Everlasting is usually used to end a fight because of the other effect of Tremor Superposition. At the end of the turn in which it was applied, it disappears, replacing itself with normal Tremor. For obvious reasons, that's not a great help to keeping up your damage. Superposition does, at least, have one more upside. When triggering amplitude conversion, instead of replacing superposition, you instead add that Tremor type to the entangled stack. This will be more relevant later, but for now, just keep in mind that conversion is generally better. I prefer to keep up the theme of good IDs, so here's our next triple O, Oofy Heath. Much like Regret Faust, he's a controversial one, but it's for a pair of interesting reasons. He's got a shockingly good kit, considering every prior ID, universal double coin power conditionals, high tremor and count infliction, and a passive that for some reason isn't just part of his S3. He's got a surprisingly durable set of stats, with only 2 stagger thresholds, reasonably high defense level, and relatively high HP, along with a defense skill that makes sustaining tremor pretty easy, given that it's just unkept tremor count for some reason. Against mono/slash enemies, he can just feed you enough count to last an eternity. This probably seems like it's all upside, and if Tremor had developed slightly differently, I'd easily be suggesting him as part of your main 7. As is though, he's usually going to be a backup ID, given he's got a good support passive for the team, completely lacks sloth, only has 1 burst per rotation, on top of not triggering Everlasting, given that it's a passive burst, and this one is Cope, his S3 applies amplitude conversion. To quickly sidetrack, his conversion, Decay, is one of the better Tremor types, being 1 defense level down for each 4 potency. To try and explain these issues without getting too far ahead, Sloth, as you saw earlier, is mandatory to get full value from Faust's Everlasting. Tremor bursts are incredibly important, and some people think that having a skill that converts Tremor is impossible to avoid, when we have a far more valuable Tremor type it might replace. The last one is a symptom of win rating, given that you can either just not use the S3, target a different enemy or part, or use it early enough that it either goes before the skill that applies your preferred Tremor type on an entanglement turn, or before it actually has its conversion condition met. The other issues are harder to deal with, but they're not so crippling as to make him unusable, just to make him not a top 7 ID. As for E.G.O, he's got a couple good ones, and one that I'll at least mention. Asymmetrical inertia is pretty impressive for an E.G.O no one remembers. A 2-coin 24 roll is pretty underwhelming when only at 3 weight, especially on an E.G.O with no power or weight conditionals. The tremor gain is pretty minor and tends to disappear quickly. I'll explain clock winding after the rest of the E.G.O, but keep in mind that it's a small buff, not anything all that impactful. As for the on-hits, they're good, but suffer from similar issues to Garden of Thorns, needing high resonance turns back to back. The passive helps, but one fragile really isn't that great, especially at once per turn per enemy. Thankfully, the cost is pretty low, and it's not like his other He options are that impressive. The overclock is harder to justify. You just add 1 to all the effects, and can gain up to 2 extra tremor count on self by resonance. The main upside is the much higher base power, to the point where even if both coins heads hit, you'll still deal more damage than the Awakening. Tremor clock winding won't be forgotten here, So here's the effects. 2 more max speed is nice, getting Heath to a 4-8 speed range, but the main point of clock winding is the second line. 1 extra infliction per coin is a fine effect, but the fact that you lose a tremor count on self for each will rapidly cost you the entirety of the stack. You'll spend 1 to 2 off of every single one of Heath's skills, on top of the 1 per turn that Tremor normally decays. Outside of enemies that inflict Tremor, clock winding will only really be around, best case, for 3 turns. This does let me segue into the game's most underwhelming E.G.O, Heath's Holiday. This E.G.O is pretty well known as just not being worth the effort, with it requiring a gluttony A-res to laugh as Ring E, being able to apply charge to allies on entirely random teams, and being in the same slot as Body Sack. I'm not going to try to convince you it's good here, quite the opposite actually. Looking at this passive, you'd probably assume that it synergises with asymmetrical inertia, given the self-inflicted tremor count. Technically, that does work, but only if you don't trigger the conversion. Yes, clock winding is treated as a buff, which makes sense, but makes Holiday, once again, garbage. I'd pretty obviously just suggest ignoring it. Binds has Tremor, but I don't have too much to say. It's expensive, but good. You don't really have any competition in the war slot. Sometimes you use it, sometimes it even matters. Before I move on though, I feel it's worth mentioning that Heath was our first source of Tremor conversion. He really did bring us to the modern version of Tremor. If I felt sticking directly to the timeline was important, I could mention Cavernous Wailing Honglu before our next ID, but I feel that keeping a coherent video flow is more valuable than being entirely accurate, especially when there's only a 2-week delay between the most core part of a Tremor team and the ID intended to use it. But, as is my standard, I'll bring up the 00 first. Yuridivi Ryoshi is fine. As far as Tremor 00s go, she's not miserable or anything, but given that the 00 before her was Mola E, she feels pretty underwhelming. Her spread is almost identical to E's, with 11-13-13 bases and 13-17-19 conditionally. Her passive exists, but it suffers from being Resonance that has an extra requirement, and then the payoff is a slightly better skill one. Her best on field aspect is her count infliction on the S2, given nothing else she has is at all special. Thankfully, she's useful for her support passive. 1 extra tremor count from skills is an already existing support passive, and it only triggering twice a turn is underwhelming, but unlike other, similar examples, this one doesn't require benching a notably good ID. I'll get back to Ryoshi later, but she's just another sinner without any Tremor E.G.O. Now, for the real core of Tremor. Yuridivi Honglu is easily the most important ID Tremor has, and as you're probably aware, not for any real part of his kit. It's not bad, obviously, but none of this is special. Single coin power conditionals, standard base numbers, an awful defense skill, no major gimmicks, and a charge, S3, that takes an eternity to actually fully fuel. To rub salt on the wound, the tremor on that S3 is entanglement, not conversion, and for some reason it's just a strict -3 count with no infliction of any kind. His passive is pretty underwhelming, given that almost none of his damage comes from his actual rolls, but hey, at least it's not resonance. His support, on the other hand, is that good, but also won't ever be relevant until someone else gets a tremor on par or better than Reverb. Speaking of which, the E.G.O. While Soda does, technically, count as a Tremor E.G.O, even I can't claim that it's at all relevant for that. No, the important one is Cavernous Wailing. To begin, this is one of the most expensive Teth E.G.O, with an 8 resource cost, and 3 of that being pretty scarce gloom. It's absolutely worth it though, given the 3-weight 26 roll with somewhere between 5 and 40% bonus damage, a 3-2 tremor stack on all targets, a tremor burst, and between those two, a conversion, notably not an entanglement, into tremor reverb. Tremor reverb is honestly just a really poorly designed mechanic, for reasons that hopefully are self-explanatory. It's easily the most straightforward variant, simply adding sloth damage to each burst equal to tremor on the target. No map, no cap, no interaction with effects that change stagger threshold gains, just damage. The odd parts are the fact that first, this doesn't cause any loss of count, unlike 2 similar effects that we got later, that it can get the full 99 damage, with no cap to max 30 or something. The fact that the E.G.O and not the huge investment S3 is what applies conversion, given that you have way more access to an E.G.O, and that, and this one is the most baffling to me, the very next banner released Everlasting Faust, meaning that they knew they were adding the most brain-dead 1-2 E.G.O combo. It's not like the corrosion or passive are bad to make up for it. The corrosion has a slightly better damage conditional, twice the tremor and bursts, and the same weight and roll. You'll rarely use it, but that's only because the best part of the E.G.O can't be doubled. The passive is in a similar boat, with it being a fine set of debuffs, but almost never being at all relevant, with how little Euro Hung bursts Tremor. This is the entire reason people get so pissy about alternate Tremor effects, because if you mess up and lose reverb, you do genuinely gut your damage output. It's also the reason I find Tremor the most boring status, but that's for later. Our penultimate Tremor 00 ID, and Teacup Rodion is a perfect example of a 00, a worse version of the 000 on her banner. The worst part, she's relevant. 11, 14, 14 bases are insulting, but with conditionals and borrowed time, I'll explain that one later, she can clash up to a 17, 20, 24, which is far better looking. Please ignore that 6 of that per skill is clash power. She's loaded with clash win effects, including a lot of tremor count, but she lacks for bursts, only having one burst on the S3, followed by an extremely delayed burst. Time Moratorium will be explained later, but to access it requires borrowed time. Borrowed Time is an interesting buff, and one only accessible from T-Corp defense skills. It reads far more complex than it plays, so here's how it actually goes. You pop the defense skill, and at the end of that turn, you get Borrowed. This is a combat start, so actually having the skill trigger is entirely optional. Borrowed then immediately triggers, giving you haste, clash power, and fragile equal to the count for next turn, so 2 for Roger, 3 for the triple O's, and then the potency increases by 1. Then, next turn, you'll gain 1 of haste, clash power, and fragile, the potency will hit 3, and suddenly this line here looks scary. You get auto-staggered next turn, right? Wrong. You only get bind from borrowed time at 1 count, and once that actually gets applied, the borrowed time has already expired. The only way to get auto-staggered is for an enemy to actually apply bind while you borrow, and then it has to exceed your haste application. Truly a wild status. The real cost is needing to burn a turn on guarding, and for Rodion, and also Altis, that's needed to access Time Moratorium, the real core of their kits. I'll explain what that is with Don, but given that was Rodion's last ID here, I should probably go into her E.G.O. Effervescent Corrosion, probably better known as Overshadowed by Rhymeshank, is honestly a pretty good tool. Assuming a high HP target, you can get a 25 rolling 4 weight that sets up an obscene amount of tremor count, a bit of bind, a burst, and an entirely worthless passive. The corrosion is mostly just a downgrade, but sometimes it comes up. As for Teacup Dom, she's fine. Her purpose, much like Rodion, is Time Moratorium, but that's only majorly useful for making nuke turns even more explosive, and outside of that, she's just a normal triple OID. She's got standard base rolls, standard infliction, a big S3, and instead of coin power, clash power for all her skills. She's supposed to be a tank, with her having high HP and defense level, aggro across her kit, and a passive that, if it ever triggers, is incredibly effective, but I still have no love for tanks in Limbus, and nothing here is impressive enough for me to care. Her best aspect is undoubtedly being the greatest source of gluttony Tremor has access to, but given how little gluttony you actually need, there's a better option. Her guard is notably better than Rodion's. Not only does it have an extra coin power and inflict an extra tremor when hit, but it also applies an extra borrowed time. Given how borrowed time scales, that's a major buff. For some reason using it lowers Don's defense level by 2, which is a bizarre choice, but hey. Finally, I'll get into the S3's gimmicks, starting with Tremor Chain. For some reason, one of the weakest Tremor variants we've discussed so far is also the most restricted. For each 10 tremor potency on the target, they get 1 clash power down to a max of 3. That's it. I don't know why it's not attack power down, why it caps at 3, or why it's 10 potency for each power down, but it mostly exists to wipe away reverb. Now, to finally get to Time Moratorium. It's an incredible effect, given it's one of the few sources of multiplicative damage scaling, especially against sloth weak enemies. Don gets hers easily, you just need the target of 10 plus tremor potency. That's pretty easy when her S3 applies 5. She does consume 10 if she doesn't have borrowed time, but that's entirely negligible. Rodion and Altis, I may as well bring her up now, need to have used their defense skill to pick up borrowed time, which does make getting it consistently harder, given that if you roll the skill 3 early, you can't gain borrowed time before you use it, unless you wait for the next batch of skills. The main reason you'd want more than one ID to apply it is this line here. If you reapply Moratorium, you instantly trigger all the stored damage, which while it doesn't help you actually deal more damage, does let you get a cool screenshot, or allow you to do some MD achievements. Don does have a couple of pieces of Tremor E.G.O, but none are super relevant. Wishing Ken is good, but for reasons entirely irrelevant to Tremor. It's a 3-weight Paralyze E.G.O. It might be the worst one we have, but that's only because it's a stacked category. The Corrosion can apply 3 Tremor bursts on 3 targets while only eating 2 count. The minor issue is you're only guaranteed to lose 2 count for 1 burst, with the other 2 needing a crit and the tails hit, neither being at all consistent. Fluid Sac has slightly better utility in terms of bursting Tremor, but is also pretty damn costly at 4 gloom, and while still a good E.G.O, it's not that likely to be used more than a couple of times ever. Given I just mentioned her, I'll jump ahead to let myself talk about Teacup Autis. She's probably the only interesting Tremor content we've gotten, given the fact that she's the only ID with competition. Mechanically, she's pretty good, and clearly designed to shore up the usual issues of a Tremor ID. Single coin power conditionals make me cry, but her passive gives her +1 final power while in borrowed, her guard is a decent clashable that sustains Tremor count, and her chain infliction is saved for enemies that have normal Tremor, making it an actual strict improvement instead of a potential risk. Her infliction is pretty good, with her S1 being fairly normal, but her S2 being 4 potency, and separate conditionals for 2 Tremor counts, and -1 count for a burst. Nothing about this is particularly special, but it's all good. Her S3 is, and this is a genuine compliment, one of the most interesting skills we've ever gotten. First, it rolls high, being able to clash it up to a 28, having multiple damage conditionals, 3 bursts, removing her borrow time to avoid the self-inflicted bind, and giving her a permanent, if somewhat minor, buff. The last coin is where the real source is though, being our first post-launch example of a skill explicitly gaining coin power mid-use. Technically other skills can do this, but that's all just due to conditionals changing between coins, instead of gaining coin power from effects while actually attacking. On top of up to 100% more damage, 2 bursts, and the standard 2 time moratorium. I'd say that I prefer her to Mola Autis, but that feels disingenuous, given that would imply I actually play Tremor on my own time. Getting back to the timeline, and we do get another actually interesting ID, with Zvi-ish being a decent tank, and one that thankfully is almost entirely disconnected from the other Zvi IDs. She was our first ID with a clashable guard, and much like Wildheat's counter was pretty overtuned, her guard is a similar case. To describe it simply, it's 2 Tremor bursts on clash win, while also giving Ish +15 defense level as long as she uses it every other turn. Genuinely, you'd be correct to exclusively use it if there's a single skill she can clash with. Her actual skills are all fine, with standard bases, pretty good effects, and conditionals that are great, if you're doing a solo, and kind of mid if you have anyone else using her skill slots. Her only skill you should actually care about is the S3, given it has 3 bursts, a quad coin power conditional, and a pretty meaty set of damage conditionals, along with up to 24 Tremor potency infliction. If you play her just with defense, E.G.O and this, you're doing it right. And that seems like a good segue. Snag Harpoon is a Tremor E.G.O, you'll probably run it, and it's honestly fine. I don't have much else to say about it, although the passive does nothing for Ish's guard. Capote is even less relevant, and I'd suggest running Rosette instead, given how overtuned it is. Christmas Nightmare is great, easy to afford, has a nice passive, and just kind of does everything you want from a he, aside from healing. Please ignore this line on the overclock. You could run Wingbeat for that, but I really don't like gambling that much. Tidal Elegy is the new and shiny collab piece, but while it's good, it'll generally be worse for you than Christmas. Please feel free to experiment with it though, it's great against single part enemies. Unfortunately, Flower Guardian-ish is some absurd power creep and makes Vi hard to justify, what with her complete lack of everlasting synergy. Much to my chagrin, I have another double O to mention, Zvi Sinclair 2 being the diet version of Zvi-ish. He's bad, can be entirely disregarded, and his best aspect is his actually great support passive. I do not care enough to actually give a rundown, but be thankful he actually got this much of a mention, given that I actually like his next ID. Speaking of which, Thumbsync is good. Yes, I know, people aren't happy he's a triple O, but I'm absolutely the exception. Getting new IDs I might actually use more than a support passive is a major upside, and if they're as well designed as this, I'm more than fine with not getting as many IDs as we used to. His rolls are all, slightly, above average. Because getting unique Tremor on enemies is pretty trivial here, you'll have easy access to all of Sync's conditionals. Scorch is worse than Reverb, but not utterly worthless given how easily burn is sustained, and on an entanglement turn, it's just extra damage. Try and save the S3 for then, or at least avoid using it right after Cavernous. A 2-1 Tremor stack off of the S1, while not wild, is above average for most Tremor IDs, who usually get a 1-1 or 2 of 1, and held by his huge amount of Tremor bursts. The S2 is a fairly standard count early burst late skill, although unique among those by having a damage conditional that hits plus 30% at a mere 12 stack. The S3 is, obviously, his best tool, and it's honestly wild how much this one does. Firstly, it rolls a 26 with minimal effort, only needing a 16 potency split between Burn and Tremor for +2 coin power, and then spending 3 bullets for +55% damage, full unbreakables, and +3 base power. Then, it inflicts 3 Tremor count, a 7-3 burn stack, converts Tremor to Scorch, and then spends 3 Tremor count on 3 Tremor bursts. As if all of that wasn't enough, it also gives him 3 damage up the following turn, all on an ID with 15 starting ammo. If you think Thumbsync only exists for handing off ammo to Mer, you'll be both disappointed and surprised. That said though, him handing off ammo is both very good, and something you actually need to plan for. He also has exactly 0 E.G.O with any Tremor effects, so that'll make it quicker to get to. Mer is as good here as on Burn, though held back by Tremor being a worse team overall, and Scorch not always being an upside. Unlike Sync, I'm not just going to copy and paste the Burn script, though I won't lie, I was tempted. He's still a simple good ID, which I appreciate for an ID this text dense, but I still think it's a good idea to at least go a little more in depth than that. I'm not here to give any credence to win rate with insert good ID, because I feel that's a disservice to the mechanical requirements of even the most dull, overtuned ID. As for Mer himself, I'll try and do a better job explaining what makes him good here. If you want a general overview though, the Burn vid is better for that. First, it's worth noting that even after dumping all his bullets, he remains almost exactly as effective in Tremor as before. He'll lose clash power from overheat and the actual benefits from spending ammo, but he'll become an even faster, fairly tanky ID, and one with a disgustingly good counter that you can genuinely just use every turn. His infliction is great, with universally high potency and high count on everything but the S1. This all only gets better as he spends ammo, with +1 infliction in Savage Tiger Mark, and +2 if he spends 8 total ammo. He can only get the +2 after swapping ammo types, but you can spend the 8 before and then swap. As for swapping, you'll almost always want to spend 8 bullets, then use the counter. Spending all 12 to swap is too slow, countering immediately prevents you accessing max value overheat, and getting staggered should almost never actually happen. I'll just skip to E.G.O here, this video is long enough already. Regret exists and will be mentioned, though bonus points for being an absurdly count positive skill that just does everything for Tremor. It purges debuffs on Mer, deals bonus damage against targets without stagger thresholds, and an overclock that can hit a pretty respectable weight given the cost, though it very rarely comes up. It's not even expensive. As always, use regret. Crushbound Past is also great, though definitely limited by the fact that few fights in Limbus last anywhere near enough time for this to be all that impactful. It's not too expensive in terms of what resources are needed, but outside of Superbia you're going to need to wait till turn 3 to actually use it, and that means waiting until turn 6 for accumulated past to actually help. The E.G.O itself is fine though, an obscenely high weight, some conditions to help speed through ads, and then a bunch of damage conditionals on the last 2 coins. If you can get a target to 100 total Tremor potency and count, you also get 4 bursts, which is nothing to scoff at. I also really want to mention the Corrosion, because it's pretty cool. While it'll usually not do quite as much damage as the Awakening, given Mer's access to coin power, it's still a high rolling, high weight E.G.O with up to 212% bonus damage, and similar infliction. It even shares the 4 bursts, and this line here. As for what that line does, it's just the downside, mostly. People have misread it in a lot of ways, and again, not really their fault, but all it actually does is change the main target's Tremor type to superposition without adding a new effect, just keeping the current. This means there's no downside to popping it during any nuke turn, nor before you actually apply your important Tremor types, that just being Reaver. Finally, and this is me stalling to avoid talking about 4 wretched IDs, we have Capote and Pursuance. Pursuance is barely a Tremor E.G.O, being a known, decent healing E.G.O, and one that occasionally does something with its single bursts. Capote is also good, being a big roll with some decent buffs, but also eating Tremor counts. I'll be putting Capote in the actual team, though that's because I'm actually putting a relevant fluid stack user in for once. I've tried my best in these videos, and I think I've done a decent job at keeping them on topic. I haven't started mentioning other teams midway through, and I even resisted the urge to bring up ring IDs in this one. So it pains me to have to now divert into Rupture for 3 IDs in a row. I'll lead with the only one that has no real debate, mostly because they actually are a Tremor ID, Wu Branch Isang. He's not a great ID, at least by the standards of almost every other ID we've gotten this season, but he's also completely fine, and far more at home in Tremor than Rupture. An effective 13, 16, 20 baseline with 15, 20, 26 conditionals, 2 final power from Linebreaker, which as per usual will be discussed later, and a 26 rolling S3-2 that dumps the whole Linebreaker stack. notably before actually getting the 2 power from Linebreaker. What's an interesting design? His defensive skill is pretty good honestly, standard clashable guard rolls, combat start for his second unique buff, and an incredibly rare debuff Purge. The lack of any real effects is a shame, but not everyone can be Zwei-ish. As for those unique buffs, Strider Woo is far easier to explain, and also far easier to complain about. As with every high shell, it's gained from the S3 and guard, except with some slight caveats. Each turn, you get 2 haste, twice the Woo stack of aggro, and before hitting the target, you inflict Tremor on the target equal to the Woo value. None of this is great, but it makes his speed conditionals easier, and 2 to 3 extra Tremor from his skills is hardly an issue. What is an issue is how Woo is gained. Unlike Strider Mao, it's gained next turn from the guard, which means you don't get the haste until 2 turns after you guard. Why it's designed like that is beyond me. Linebreaker thankfully lacks that issue. You gain 1 on Clash Win if you have Woo, 1 on attack start if you're 2 speed above the target, and 1 for every 2 Tremor bursts E skills trigger. Notably, this does include E.G.O skills. Now, here's a list of all of E's E.G.O that burst Tremor. All of this is to a max of 3 Linebreaker per turn, and to a total cap of 5 Linebreaker. Linebreaker itself has 4 uses. The 2 final power I mentioned earlier when at the full 5 stack, 10 shield HP per turn per stack, being consumed to use the S3 too, and then this absolute garbage that has no right to exist. I'm sure the twice per turn will really help. Finally, the Alt S3. It's pretty mid. You apply 1 Clash power with Flavor Text to every other ally next turn, get full Unbreakables and an extra Tremor burst, gain 2 weight, and become a notably weaker skill against single targets. I'm not going to explain the math, but you genuinely don't want this if you aren't using the weight. You also, on both versions, inflict the last part of the kit, Concussion. Concussion is probably the most misunderstood effect we have, and I can't really blame people for it. This wording is cruel. To put it as simply as possible, all the rupture damage you inflict is increased by 20%, and all the stagger threshold raises caused by Tremor Burst are increased by 20%. The only way this helps with Tremor dealing damage are these 3 effects. 2 of those have absurdly low caps, and no one reads any part of the third except the passive. Is Wusang bad? No, he's honestly a pretty decent Tremor ID. He's also entirely unimpressive, has multiple core issues, and is probably the 9th best Tremor ID. At least he's no use Sinclair. But the rupturing doesn't stop there. Next, I have to mention 2 IDs that just don't have Tremor anywhere in their kits, if only because one has synergy with the most poorly designed E.G.O ever, and the other is just Cope. Let's start with the Cope. Lord Honglu has 0 place here. The only reasons people consider him is because he's the flashy new bad end ID, and has marginal synergy with 2 niche IDs. Simply put, this garbage connection with Wusang is absolutely worthless. You get 1 burst a turn on the provision you've used an S3 earlier in the fight, don't use an E.G.O that turn, and have Wusang as your earliest deployed high shell ID. To help with this, he has no access to Sloth without E.G.O, no ability to sustain poise or rupture for his conditionals, no tremor infliction, and quite frankly, no reason to be ran. He also doesn't trigger Everlasting with this effect. Maybe, if he still didn't have a Tremor ID, I could see the vision, but this is only marginally better than running him in Burn with you Sinclair. The other ID is unfortunately far more justifiable, has far less issues for the team, and while I still absolutely despise running her, Malfaust is the best option. For those of you hinged enough to not see the synergy, I envy you. Simply put, you always want Everlasting as early in the turn order as possible to maximise the value of the entanglement for the 1 turn you get it, and what better way to do that than an ID with 5 free haste a turn. It's not like this is surprising. Regretfaust is pretty damn slow, especially with how many Tremor IDs gain haste, and it's not like Malfaust lacks Sloth. She also clashes better, and she's also, generally speaking, a better ID. So, what's not to like? Distancing myself from my biases here, I genuinely do have some complaints about her, but I don't think the first few are more than nitpicks. The last one is more relevant though. First, Mao has worse Sin affinities. Both Fausts have a Sloth S1 and Pride S2, but regret having a Wrath S3 and Gloom counter does actually come up, with those 2 being both rarer and more important resources than Mao's Gluttony options. Secondly, Regret has weight on the S2 and S3. Being able to deal damage across multiple targets is always good, and would be a much cleaner argument if Mao didn't have assist defense. You also can just reset the fight or wait a turn if Regretfaust is too slow, but I don't think everyone is fine resetting constantly. My actual issue though? Mao has no Tremor bursts and no Tremor infliction aside from Everlasting. While Regret might only average to 1 burst per enemy every 2 turns, that's far more than Mao, and aided by her pretty good infliction, with 3 count on the S1 and 5 potency on each of up to 2 targets with the S2. The team code will run Mao, but swap away if you want, the E.G.O and deployment order remains unchanged. I hate this ID. It's easily my most despised since Encore Mer, and honestly I might be more down on Ryoshi than Massault here. At least no one was expecting coherent design in Season 1. To actually get into detail however, the kit. Her rolls are entirely standard, and none of her conditionals past her maximum damage conditional on the S32 being much of an issue to get going. Her Sin affinities are fine on both Tremor and Bleed, she has consistent sloth access, I'll get to that, and especially Envy, a resource Tremor really can struggle with, but then you get to her effects, and suddenly her usage on either team becomes harder to justify. Given that the only other Tremor Bleed synergy at her release was Endon, a garbage ID no one would have ever actually considered, half of these effects were almost entirely worthless, no matter what team she was on, and it's not as though these numbers were great even if you got full mileage from them. About the only thing I could praise was Infliction Order, with her applying potency before count on the S2 and S3, but that didn't make up for an 0-1, 2-1, 2-0, 4-1 spread, along with her S2 going down to a 2-0 for Tremor if the target has 3 or more Tremor counts. To further salt the wound, Tremor Hemorrhage is easily the weakest Tremor variant, being a carbon copy of Scorch, except on a far more volatile secondary effect, and not having Thumb Mer and Sync's impressive infliction to boost and sustain it. The choice to have this each bleed count on burst is truly inexplicable, given that Tremor won't want it due to it replacing your good conversions with dog shit, and Bleed won't want it, given that it disappears the same turn it's applied, unless you get absurd luck with E-Sang. Gaze does let me actually compliment Ryo again at least. It's a strong, interesting effect, and one that isn't just bizarrely handicapped. While it's swapping between Contempt and Gaze at max stacks might seem like a straight downside, proper timing allows you to have Ryo alternate between high damage and high durability turns, and her S3 gains an absurd amount of damage against contempted targets. The fact it spends all the stacks of Gaze and Contempt sucks, but her wind-up isn't so slow as to be a major issue. Finally, the guard, the part of her kit that's somehow been misjudged the most. This is awful, no matter the team, but the reasons are legitimately different for each. On Tremor, this is effectively a crutch to make up for Ryo's lack of any sloth E.G.O, so she can help during everlasting turns. The issue? It's not like the enemy is going to be doing much attacking during any of those nuke turns, and even if they do, the reward is 3 bleed count, best case, on a team with no other bleed support. Even the support passive sucks. Bleed gets a 1-1 stack, which is so much worse than just running KK, it's not even funny. And Tremor somehow gets an even worse option, with a passive that wants your earliest deployed Sinner to be hit 3 times a turn. I do not want to hear anything about her being good in MD. Everyone is good in MD, and that's such a nothing statement that I do not care to respond. If you want to run Ryoshi on Tremor, Eurodivvy is fine. If you want to run Ryoshi on Bleed, KK is great. And if you want to run a tanky E.G.O gear Ryoshi on Bleed, we have Red Eyes. I genuinely can't think of a worse fate for this design. For all my complaints about Fell Bullet E, at least he both plays like the enemy he's based on and has actual synergy with his E.G.O. And then Night Owl Greg released. Somehow, PM managed to make a Bleed Tremor ID that actually works right after Encore Ryo, and it's helped massively by Open Wound and its 2 upgrades. I don't want to discount the rest of the kit because his numbers are all good, but having a way to try and make up for Ryo's issues is great, made more so by Gregor being, well, Gregor, and therefore getting Unbrilliant glory. Unfortunately, my initial prediction of Unbrilliant getting a perfect ID in 2 banners was wrong, but 3 was decently close. As for the kits, it's just good. Unlike Ryoshu, he has actual infliction and pretty impressive bursts, given things like the Clash Wind Tremor bursts and an Alt S3 that bursts 3 times, while also setting up an absurdly good debuff in Fatal Wound. As for the wounds, Open is pretty irrelevant, with 1 bind next turn being almost entirely worthless, although you'll only have Open for 1 turn. Deep is better, with it applying slightly more bind and up to 2 count per turn. This is mostly just a way to make up for Hemorrhage being hot garbage, but beggars can't be choosers, and then you get to apply Fatal if you use a skill 3 on a target with deep wounds. This will reset the stack back to the max of 3, and effectively be a death right in terms of count application. 6 count per turn is genuinely absurd, and while not overly relevant in Tremor, him having a 3 burst S3 is good for any entanglement turn. His main upsides for Tremor is just being an above curve ID with access to multiple nice E.G.O and the ability to absolutely shred enemies with bloated health pools. Any enemy at 20% or less will pretty much instantly fold against Greg and his 3 attacks a turn, given how high his damage conditionals are. And the final ID for this video, Jong Office Ishmael is just a Flower Guardian player, except instead of spending 30 minutes to end on nothing, she spends 2 to 4 turns to get a free 5 coin skill, while consistently bursting Tremor, having absurd rolls, and infliction is genuinely pretty good for a hybrid. Her gimmick, as text-dense as it is pretty simple. To start, simply use the suit she tells you to. All her skills will roll great turn 1, on top of providing free bright, and sometimes even 2 resources. Turn 2 is where any actual difficulties can arise. If you got lucky, you'll have another copy of the same skill, which you should absolutely fire off. That will get you to 3 bright, which is a huge threshold, but most likely you'll roll into a different skill. You've got 2 choices. If you can afford it, an E.G.O of that suit will get you to 4 bright, which gives you plenty of options for the next turn to get that last point. If you can't, you'll either have to use a counter, which can give a bright, re-rolls your suit to something you'll be guaranteed to have, and discards bad skills. I'd recommend only using the counter if you played a skill 3 on turn 1, then got offered a skill 1 and 2 on turn 2. Otherwise, if you drew 2 of the same skill, just go for that. You'll get a guaranteed 5 bright Kazan from it. Turn 3, with some luck, you'll have 3 to 4 bright. If you're God's strongest gambler, just use the skill that matches your suit or an S3, and you'll get your 5 bright Kazan on turn 3. If you're slightly less lucky, use any E.G.O, and you'll also get a 5 bright. If you're unlucky and poor, you'll have to gamble. The counter has a 50-50 chance of giving you that last point of bright, on top of just clashing well. Use that, hope you get lucky, and if not, you'll manage to barely scrape by with the suit it gives you next turn. Then, just repeat the process once you spent all your brights, and you'll get a bunch of bursts for a pretty cheap cost. Now, this does require 3 specific E.G.O for her to be maximally consistent, but thankfully, none of them are hard to get. Either of her Zines work, although 100-footed is slightly easier to afford. Capote should be run as her Teth, and Christmas as her He. If she ever got a sloth E.G.O in a non-He, non-Teth slot, you'd pretty happily slot in Tidal Elegy, but having consistent access to all 3 suits is incredibly important. If you roll Gloom as your first suit, for example, this can let you 2-turn Kazan while bursting Tremor 4 times and applying Decay. She does have some issues with Everlasting, mostly around the fact that her only bursts that trigger it are on her E.G.O and Kazan, but this is honestly fine. Just hit 4 bright before the nuke turn, pop Christmas, and get 5 bursts before any duplication from Everlasting, and sometimes a 6th from her passive. Before I move on to the team, I want to actually give my opinion on Tremor, and if this video somehow didn't already make it clear, I do not like Tremor. It's slow, dull, one note, and unlike Rupture, doesn't have the strength to be fun. Despite being unique and that it's built around E.G.O more than IDs, this just means that new Tremor content is inherently less important. New E.G.O in those slots are just worthless here, and any ID for the 2 important sinners may as well be interchangeable. Reverb is an utterly miserable example of game design, with it being so nauseatingly strong that any other Tremor conversion is immediately met by whining from people who don't understand how easy it is to avoid swapping Tremor types. And it's not like it's unjustified either. If you ever lose Reverb, you no longer have damage. This isn't the same as going without Dark Flame or Deathrite Haste for a turn, you basically just pause your fight till you reapply it. But no one's here to hear me complain, so here's the team. There shouldn't be any debate on B's lot, be it to support passives or deployed IDs, and I've made my thoughts on Malfaust clear already, so the lack of regret Faust should also be unsurprising. As for these 5 clowns though, I'll try and at least explain my thought process. I think that Wusang is vital for his Sin affinities. Yuridiva Ryoshu is a great support passive with little debate. If you do swap her out, make sure you let your first ID eat a few hits each turn. Goofy Heath has a similarly great support passive, and given that chain battles exist, good IDs with good support passives are at a premium, which also goes for Teacup Rodion, although less impressive on both counts than Heath. I think Teacup Altus is slightly better than Mola, but that's mostly due to her S1 and guard being better. If you find count isn't an issue, feel free to swap over to Mola. Lastly, Gregor is only really relevant for enemies that completely lack ads, so swapping with E-Sang when attack weight actually matters. E.G.O are far more important here than anywhere else, not for their effects, but for their affinity. Every Sinner you run needs a slot skill or E.G.O to be worth considering, and if they don't have consistent sloth access, be it due to ego cost or skill rank, they immediately become worse. So Ish needs Christmas Nightmare, Heath needs Asymmetrical, and both Cavernous Wailing Hong and Everlasting Faust are mandatory content. Now, as for playing the team, it sure is a team. Simply put, you set up resources and a Tremor stack until you have the wealth of resources to dump into a perfect turn. Now, I'm going to go through the long list of requirements to actually have this work, but it's worth mentioning that this is pretty free in most dungeons, given the ease of resetting early and the huge amount of resources you can hoard. Faust needs to be first, while Hong needs to be close to second if you don't have reverb already. Then, every ID needs to have either a sloth skill or E.G.O that they can slot to ensure you get a 5+ sloth A-res. This will likely cost another E.G.O, though with some luck you can get away with just Everlasting. Third, have every one of those attacks target the enemy you want dead, defense skills can go wherever. And finally, hope and pray that whatever enemy you're doing this to doesn't have a health gate, or God forbid a debuff cleanse. Not only does this take far more effort than any other team's nuke turn, unless you have Time Moratorium on the enemy, you'll likely get out damaged by every other team. About the only upside you get from Tremor is having the ability to both multiply the damage of their status with both Everlasting and Entangling Scorch and Reverb together, and then being able to turn the entirety of your damage output to a different Sin affinity, allowing you to, against sloth weak enemies, get some decent damage multipliers. This isn't exactly a common thing though. On an ID by ID basis, here's my general tips. Autis and the other T-Corps always want to be in borrowed time, if possible, while Murd doesn't care to defend until after reloading already. You don't want to trigger Sync's reload passive until the same turn as Murd does his ult S3, even better if you can have Sync die afterwards to trigger it again. Honglu should hit Cavernous as soon as feasible, and any entanglement or conversions should avoid overwriting the reverb, as has hopefully been made clear already. And finally, Mao Faust. Assist defense doesn't trigger if the target of the attack is using a defense skill, Faust is the target, or the skill is target fixed or unclashable. She also doesn't get to profit on Tianju's blade if another ID triggers Deathrite before her turn, given she's capped at 5 passive triggers a turn. None of this is a deal breaker for Faust, but it's stuff you'll actually need to consider instead of just win rating. That should be everything, and hopefully I'll never have to consider this team again. Rupture is sadly the next and final video, so I'll be seeing you then, though that might be a while away. Before I go though, I'll try the YouTuber stuff. Like, comment, sub, all that nonsense. If I can get to 1k subs, I'll stop begging for all this stuff.